Welcome back to the podcast. This is part 2 of our 2-part episode on the life of Freud. If you have not listened to part 1 yet, we highly recommend starting there. It will give you the full context and make everything in this episode much clearer. If you are all caught up, let us jump right in and continue where we left off. This podcast discusses real-world cases and psychological phenomena related to early childhood trauma, child abuse, and various psychological conditions. Some listeners may find these topics emotionally distressing. Listener discretion is advised. The content is provided for educational and informational purposes only, aiming to explore Freud's life and examine how his experiences influenced the development of his theories and contributions to psychology. Freud continued to long for a strong male figure he could admire, identify with, and aspire to resemble. This need was fulfilled when Wilhelm Fliess, a respected doctor from Berlin, entered his life. Much like Freud, Fliess embraced some unusual notions and theories, and the two men began exchanging letters that revealed a shared intensity and, at times, a touch of madness. Their correspondence was highly unusual. Freud wrote to Fliess with complete openness, sharing every thought that crossed his mind. Many of his letters were poetic and even slightly romantic. In fact, he was more emotionally expressive with Fliess than with his own wife. His once romantic letters to Martha had become dull and practical by comparison. Freud viewed Fliess as a superior, someone he needed, though he sensed that Fliess did not need him in the same way. He idealized Fliess and held him in such high esteem that he chose him as the person with whom he would share his two developing, quote, brilliant ideas. At this time, Freud was deeply engaged in studying neuroses and reflecting on their origins. In one of his letters to Fliess, he wrote that he was convinced hysteria resulted from an inappropriately early intercourse experience forced upon an innocent child. At this stage, Freud worked entirely alone and shared his theories only with Fliess. At age 39, he decided it was time to reveal his radical, groundbreaking ideas publicly. During a lecture before the Society of Psychiatrists and Neurologists, he presented his theory on the origins of hysteria. His colleagues listened skeptically. Freud spoke about uncovering the unconscious and described hysteria as resulting from premature intercourse experience and abuse in childhood that caused severe trauma. His claims addressed extremely sensitive and taboo subjects. He also introduced his method for treating hysteria. The reaction was overwhelmingly negative. His colleagues rejected the theory outright and even dismissed it as a, quote, scientific fairy tale. Many found his ideas unacceptable and were horrified by them. Freud left the lecture deeply disappointed. Freud soon began to experience a gradual decline in his physical and emotional well-being. He developed migraines, suffered from bouts of depression, and felt various bodily pains. He became terrified of dying and was convinced that his death was imminent, believing he would suffer a fatal heart attack between the ages of 40 and 50. Despite having a wife and 6 children, he constantly wrote and spoke about how lonely he felt. Confused and overwhelmed, Freud turned inward. He began examining his own memories and dreams, swinging between moments of exhilaration and deep despair. He understood that to confront the inner demons of others, he first had to face his own. Everything seemed to be falling apart, and matters worsened when he started to suspect, and eventually believe, that he suffered from a mild form of hysteria and was neurotic. At that moment, Fliess wrote to him about a new patient with hysterical symptoms. Her well-respected father had taken her to bed from the age of 8 to 12. For Freud, this seemed to be fresh evidence supporting his theory that hysteria stemmed from the abuse of an innocent child by an older person, typically the father. But this idea had a terrible and grotesque consequence for Freud. If he himself was hysterical, then his theory implied only one possible explanation. He began to believe that his own father had abused him and his siblings as children. This horrifying thought led him to see his father as one of the very monsters he theorized about. He even wrote this conclusion to Fliess in a letter. Feeling overwhelmed and desperate for help, he turned to the only doctor he believed could treat him, himself. Freud became his own patient and began a deep process of self-analysis in an attempt to heal. During the summer when Freud's father, Jacob, fell ill, Sigmund was already in a fragile emotional state. 4 months later, Jacob died, and on the night of the funeral, Freud dreamed he was in a room with a sign instructing him to close his eyes, a room that turned out to be the barber shop he visited daily. The death of his father, which occurred on October 23, 1896, in Vienna, shook him profoundly. Freud later wrote that his father's passing had a major impact on him and changed his soul. With this loss, memories from his childhood, long forgotten or repressed, began to resurface, accompanied by disturbing dreams. Freud interpreted the dream from the night of the funeral as a revelation of his inner turmoil, a confrontation with something within himself that he did not want to see, something connected to his father. His joy for life faded. He was already suffering from physical pain, still stung by the failure of his first major lecture, and now grief overwhelmed him. Before his father's death, he had wanted success, a stable family life, and professional recognition. Afterward, he felt himself giving up. He sensed that something deep within him was troubling him, and he wanted to uncover it. Dreams now became central to Freud's thinking. While many people throughout history had wondered about the meaning of dreams, most doctors of the time dismissed this curiosity as foolish. Freud did not. He believed that dreams were simply a continuation of thinking during sleep, a way for the mind to express the worries and conflicts that preoccupied a person during the day. For example, one might dream of failing an exam or humiliating oneself on stage if such fears were present in waking life. Freud became convinced that dreams revealed the mind's deepest secrets. He began devoting himself intensely to dream analysis, his pathway into the unconscious. He had already been recording his dreams since 1892 and recalled many of them. As he interpreted these dreams, he came to believe he had discovered what they all had in common. Each dream represented an unfulfilled wish seeking satisfaction, a repressed desire. The mind hides these desires from itself because they feel unacceptable, dirty, selfish, unpleasant, or shameful. Freud believed these impulses exist in everyone, and dreams are their disguised expressions. The driving force behind every dream, according to him, was an unacceptable, infantile wish. Because these wishes appear in symbolic form, dreams must be interpreted. Repressed and forbidden childhood wishes often reappeared in dreams. Take, for example, dreams involving nudity. Children feel no shame in being naked. They move through the world freely and happily. In early human existence, in a kind of paradise Eden, people were also naked, covering themselves only because of cold or parasites. Freud believed that this paradise of nudity could be symbolically reached again in dreams. Dreams could be understood through free association. To interpret a dream properly, one needed the dreamer's own associations to its elements, since each person's symbolic meanings differ. It was also essential to know personal information about the dreamer to explain the associations in the dreams accurately. Freud illustrated the importance of this in his 12th lecture, where he analyzed the dreams of a medical student from Munich in 1910. The student's dream was as follows. Toward morning I dream. I am cycling to Tübingen along a road when suddenly a brown dachshund runs after me and grabs my heel. A little further on I get off the bike, sit on some sort of fence, and start fending off the beast, which has sunk its teeth in hard. Opposite me sit several elderly ladies, laughing at me. Then I wake up, and as has happened to me several times before, in that moment of transition to wakefulness, the meaning of the dream becomes completely clear. The dreamer then explains that he has fallen in love with a girl he sees on the street. He has no contact with her, but a meeting would be easier if he were accompanied by a dachshund, since he is very good with animals. He mentions that he has often intervened in dogfights in front of onlookers. He would always encounter the girl while cycling and accompanied by this dog. The laughing elderly ladies in the dream, then, likely symbolize the girl herself, who does not appear directly. Freud also enjoyed playing with words when interpreting dreams. In his 12th lecture, he described a man who had 2 dreams in one night, each consisting of a single image. In the first, his uncle, a devout Jew, is smoking a cigarette on the Sabbath, something he would never do. In the second, a woman is caressing him as if he were her child. The man's only association with this second image is his mother. How could these scenes be connected? Freud offered a simple key. Insert the word if. If my uncle, a holy man, were to smoke a cigarette on the Sabbath, then my mother could also caress me. Thus, just as smoking on the Sabbath is forbidden, so too is being caressed by one's mother. Freud retreated to the mountains near Vienna, where he began to seriously doubt the foundations of his own theory. A kind of mental numbness overtook him, what he later described as a, quote, mental paralysis. He became preoccupied with himself as though he were his own patient. In 1897, he wrote a letter to Fliess admitting, "The theory I have been developing is wrong." He confided a secret. He no longer believed in his theory of neuroses. The theory had failed partly because most of his patients had not actually been abused in childhood, and his father, as he came to understand, had probably not abused him either. His suspicions in that regard had been mistaken. Jacob had never abused him or any of his siblings. With this realization, the theory collapsed. The hope of gaining eternal fame, along with the wealth and recognition he had imagined, all of it had depended on his supposed discovery about hysteria. Freud concluded instead that his patients had been sharing fantasies, not factual memories from the past. There had been no abuse, only conflicting wishes and desires. The focus thus shifted from external events to the internal world, from actual trauma to unacceptable inner wishes. This marked a profound transformation in his thinking, bringing the power and significance of fantasies, dreams, and inner life to the center of his work. Themes of spirit, imagination, self-deception, truth, self-confrontation, and inner conflict became the core of his research. And in this pivotal moment, psychoanalysis was born. As Freud immersed himself ever more deeply in researching and analyzing his own psyche, disconnected memories and childhood dreams began to resurface. Among them were disturbing nightmares of masked figures with beak-like faces carrying his mother into a room, an image he found impossible to forget. To Freud, dreams were enigmatic puzzles. They played with words, hid them, and distorted them to conceal their true meaning. His method of dream interpretation therefore focused intensely on the words contained within dreams. In one example, the masked figures carrying his mother resembled birds. In German, the word for birds is also used as a vulgar term for intercourse. Although he awoke in fear, he concluded that he harbored those kind of desires for his own mother. From this line of reasoning emerged the famous idea of being in love with one's mother and feeling jealous of one's father, the foundation of what became known as the Oedipus complex. Freud soon labeled this not as a personal experience, but as a general childhood phenomenon, connecting it to the myth of Oedipus and framing it as a universal stage in development. He believed that all children possessed incestuous feelings, an extraordinary and controversial claim, especially considering how often he generalized from his own personal experiences, a method that was not particularly scientific. He was deeply admired by his mother, and her praise remained a source of great pleasure for him well into adulthood. Yet he never examined their relationship too closely, as if preserving the feeling of pure maternal love required leaving it untouched. In truth, he constructed an idealized image of his mother, one that did not fully match reality. He did not want to know who she truly was. Instead, he maintained this perfected picture of her, carefully avoiding anything that might disrupt it. With his father, however, more complicated feelings arose. When he was 10 years old, Jacob told him a story from his youth. He had once gone for a walk, dressed neatly and wearing a new fur Cossack hat, when a Christian man struck the hat from his head and shouted, "Jew!" Freud asked what he had done in response, expecting a dramatic or defiant action. "I picked up my hat," Jacob replied. This answer deeply disappointed Freud. In that moment, his father ceased to be a hero in his eyes. Freud lost respect for him and felt he had, in some way, surpassed him. As his mother's favorite, Freud began to see his father as a rival, and in this imagined rivalry he felt he had won. Yet triumph over one's own father can feel as terrible as defeat, burdened with guilt, especially after the rival's death. Through this, Freud came to understand the depth of his disappointment in his father. By the end of the 19th century, Vienna was undergoing significant change, marked by a surge of vibrant cultural activity. Artists turned inward, exploring their own inner worlds, and expressing these explorations through their work. They sought to understand and depict the irrational, much like Freud. Yet Freud himself had little interest in the cultural scene, its figures, or its artists. His tastes remained old-fashioned. He avoided typewriters, disliked automobiles, and preferred a life governed by routine and order. His days followed the same structure, his home was meticulously tidy, and he carried himself in a decidedly formal rather than relaxed manner. During this period, Freud began working on one of his most important books, The Interpretation of Dreams. The project increasingly consumed him, and he suffered from headaches and back pain as he wrote. He relied more and more on Wilhelm Fliess, giving him the manuscript to read and inviting his suggestions. Freud even brought his notes with him on vacation. He envisioned the book as modeled after a journey through Dante's Inferno, beginning in a dark forest. It ultimately became the longest book he ever wrote. He worked on it for 3 years, completing it in 1899 in the German Alps, facing the very town where, 39 years later, Hitler's eagle's nest would be built. In the book, Freud asserted that there was a psychological method for interpreting dreams. Published in November 1899 but dated 1900, the book initially drew little attention. By 1906, only 351 copies had been sold. Its fame would come only 2 decades later, exactly the delayed recognition Freud had always hoped for. In the years that followed, Freud established a movement that helped spread his ideas worldwide. Beginning in 1902, meetings were held every Wednesday at 8:30 p.m. in Freud's home, where participants gathered to discuss psychoanalysis. Each session featured a prepared leading topic, often a case study, followed by discussion, with Freud concluding each meeting by summarizing the debate. The group consisted of individuals who strongly believed in Freud's work, and many writers have drawn parallels between these Wednesday gatherings and the formation of a new religion. The unifying thread in all their discussions was the exploration of the unconscious. Initially, new members could join only by invitation, and by 1906, the group had grown to 17 participants, known at the time simply as the midweek psychological meetings. To formalize their ideas and establish authorship, they appointed a secretary, Otto Rank, who would later become an important psychoanalyst. Under Adler's presidency, the group evolved into the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society. Over time, however, theoretical disagreements intensified. Conflicts eventually led to the society's dissolution. Carl Gustav Jung also served as president at one point, but he and Freud ultimately parted ways due to personal and theoretical differences. Freud drew from these meetings a wide range of ideas, weaving them together into a theory unlike any that had existed before. As the group expanded, members also began conducting self-analyses. This practice supported theoretical development and required immense trust, as contributions were deeply personal and expected to remain confidential. The process continued for several years, resulting in numerous publications and debates about authorship of the ideas that emerged during these evenings. Eventually, members split off to establish their own schools. Alfred Adler with individual psychology, Viktor Frankl with logotherapy, and Carl Gustav Jung with analytical psychology. In 1933, the Nazis burned Freud's books along with Einstein's. Freud ironically called this progress, noting that in the Middle Ages they would have burned him, but now they burned only his books. 5 years later, in 1938, he fled to England. Freud strongly believed in treatment through truth. Know yourself was his guiding principle, and maintained that truth would ultimately set a person free. He died of mouth cancer in 1939, reportedly from smoking about 20 cigars a day. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to leave a like, share it with someone who might find it interesting, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new episode. Your support helps the podcast grow. Until next time, take care.